Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon to all of you here and those online. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second and last lecture on Persian literature in honor of Frank Lewis. It's wonderful to see this great turnout. It's a testament to both the power of Persian literature and to the memory of Frank Lewis that it brings so many people together. I forgot to say, my name is Ahmed Shamsi. I'm chair of NELC. And before I hand over to Pune Shabani Jadidi, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank those that have made this coming together possible, the generous anonymous donor and Sarah Hill and Salma Tahrani, who are standing there. Thank you so much. And Thibaut Dubert, who's going to handle the Q&A afterwards. And first and foremost, Pune herself, who's really both the engine and the positive energy behind this, and whose love for Persian literature and whose deep friendship with Frank has really made all of this possible. So again, thank you for coming, welcome, and I hand over for Pune to introduce today's speaker.
Welcome to the second lecture in University of Chicago's Franklin Lewis Lecture Series of 2023. First, I would like to express our deepest appreciation to our anonymous donor whose support has made this event and this series actually possible. Second, I would like to thank our esteemed chair, Professor Ahmed El-Shamsi at NELC, as well as my dear colleague at SALC, Professor Thibaut Dubert, who will be moderating the discussion today, as Professor El-Shamsi said. And of course, our amazing department manager, Sarah Hill, and our wonderful administrative assistant, Salma Tahrani, without whose help today's event would not have been possible. Last but not least, I would like to thank all of you who are here with us in person, especially my students, or on Zoom, for your interest in Persian literature and for joining us today to commemorate Professor Franklin Lewis, one of the world's greatest experts of Rumi, a scholar of Persian literature from medieval to modern times, as well as a translator of medieval and modern Persian poetry and prose. And I would also like to welcome Professor Lewis's wife, Furuzan Lewis, who is on Zoom with us. She wished to be here in person, but she couldn't. Our speaker is Professor Dick Davis, who was invited by Professor Franklin Lewis as the inaugural speaker in the Heshmat Muayyad lecture series in October 2018, when Professor Davis gave a brilliant talk on She Can't Be Kept Locked Up, the Forgotten Women of Medieval Persian Poetry. The talk was a section from his book, The Mirror of My Heart, 1,000 Years of Persian Poetry by Women, published in 2019, which is a beautiful bilingual edition encompassing the poetry of women from the medieval period to the present. In the beginning remarks by Professor Lewis, he said that Professor Davis was invited by Professor Heshmat Muayyad in the 1990s. So we are honored to have this legacy continue. Although Professor Davis does not need an introduction, and we are all familiar with his numerous outstanding works, I would like to say a few words about him. Professor Davis is Emeritus Professor of Persian at Ohio State University. He was born in Portsmouth, Hampshire, England, and grew up in Withensea, I hope I'm not killing the words, Yorkshire. After he graduated from the University of Cambridge, he lived in Tehran with his wife, Ms. Afkham Darbandi, and taught English at the University of Tehran for several years until the revolution. Hence his brilliant command of Persian. Of course, before he began translating from Persian to English, Professor Davis was a recognized and accomplished poet. Professor Davis has written scholarly works on both English and Persian literature, as well as 9 volumes of his own poetry. His publications include volumes of poetry and verse translation chosen as Books of the Year by the Sunday Times UK 1989, the Daily Telegram UK 1989, the Economist UK 2002, the Washington Post 2010, and the Times Literary Supplement UK 2013 and 2018, which has referred to him as our finest translator from Persian. Of course, Professor Davis has published numerous book-length translations from Persian, including 7 volumes of translations of medieval Persian poetry with Penguin Classics. His most recent books are The Mirror of My Heart, 1,000 Years of Persian Poetry by Women, published in 2019, as well as its bilingual edition in 2020, and his verse translation of Nezami's Layli o Majnun, published in 2020. He's currently completing a verse translation of Nezami's Khosrow Shirin. Some of his other works, several of which have won awards, are Faces of Love, Hafez and the Poets of Shiraz, bilingual edition published in 2019, Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, Penguin Classics 2016, When They Broke Down the Door, Poems by Fatemeh Shams 2016, Veys o Ramin, Penguin Classics 2009, winner of Lewis Ross Persian Translation Prize, My Uncle Napoleon, a novel, Modern Library, published in 2000, originally by Mage in 1996, which is also winner of Lewis Ross Persian Translation Prize. The Conference of Birds, Penguin Classics 2014, originally published by Mage 1984, also winner of Lewis Ross Persian Translation Prize. So without further ado, here is Professor Dick Davis talking about The Convent and the Cave, or The Gathering of Wisdom, Reflections on Nezami's Khosrow Shirin.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I always feel after these introductions, can we all go home now, please? As Professor Shawani Jadidi said, I was last here to give a talk in a series in memory of Professor Hishmat Moayad. And now I'm here to give a talk in memory of Franklin Lewis. If this goes on, I shall feel like Typhoid Mary. Don't invite me again. My last visit here, Frank introduced me, was a great pleasure to me. I greatly enjoyed it. It was a very nice, appreciative audience, and I had a wonderful time. I'd like to thank the people who made my coming here today possible. And I'd also like to say just a word or two about Frank. I'm sure most people in this room know Frank better than I did. Frank and I, our paths crossed very often, academically as it were. We met at conferences all the time. When I used to go to conferences, I don't anymore. We also met in other circumstances. There was a lovely do at the White House once in celebration of Persian culture, and we saw each other there, and we stood aside. There were hundreds of Iranians there, and there was me and Frank in the corner. Frank was, as I think people here know, he was an extraordinarily fine scholar, but he was also an extraordinarily fine person. It's something he shared with Professor Moayad, in fact. His scholarship was, as it were, backed up and surrounded by and contextualized by the fineness, the nobility, in fact, of his character. He was a wonderful person to know. I can't claim that we were friends. We just met all the time professionally. But we also emailed all the time. We read each other's books, and we taught each other's books, and we sort of pushed each other's books. So I feel a great debt to Frank, and I was as shocked as everybody when he passed. I was not one of the people who was aware that he was ill. Apparently only a small number of people were aware of this. And I was, as I say, very shocked and upset, because he was such a fine person. And it's a great honor to speak, to give a talk in his memory. I'm going to talk about Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin, which, as has just been said, I'm finishing up a verse translation of it. As has also been said, I've translated quite a lot of medieval Persian verse. Khosrow and Shirin is by far the most difficult text I've ever translated. It's exponentially more difficult than Layli and Majnun, and you would think, as they were by the same poet, that this doesn't seem very likely, but it is, in fact. It's much more dense than Layli and Majnun. It's much longer, too, but it's much more sort of complex in microcosm, but also in macrocosm. The sort of whole structure of the poem is very complex, but also moment by moment, the metaphors and the tropes and so forth are highly worked out. It's a very rhetorically self-conscious poem, even more than Layli and Majnun, and goodness knows that's rhetorically self-conscious too. It is, in fact, I think, if we can say that Layli and Majnun is the best-known romance by Nezami, particularly outside of Iran, and the Haft Pekar, the 7 portraits, is the most complex work by Nezami, Khosrow and Shirin is by far the most popular. At least it's the most popular in Iran and among Iranians. There has never been, this is extraordinary, there has never been a translation of it before. There have been a couple of sort of versions of it, which reduce it to about 30 pages. The text I'm using for the Persian text I'm using for my translation is 700 pages. So you can see that 30 pages, you miss out quite a lot. There hasn't been a complete translation of it before in English, as far as I know, which is astonishing. But when I started to do it, I saw why there hadn't been. It's a damn difficult poem to translate. It's very difficult. And it's also, as well as the most popular, I think this is a personal feeling, but I think other people feel it when they read Khosrow and Shirin. It's also, I believe, the most personal of Nezami's romances. It seems to be the one which is closest to his heart, in fact, in which his own character, his own view of the world, his own feeling for what being a poet and what that means, for what that is, it seems much more clear in Khosrow and Shirin than in his other works. Khosrow and Shirin is, of course, a poem that takes place in pre-Islamic Iran, and I want to begin this talk by looking at the way that Nezami's sources treated the pre-Islamic era and its rituals and mores, in contrast to the way that Nezami himself treats the same material. There is a major difference, in fact, and I think this is important in the outcome of the way that Nezami writes his poem. Nezami's source for the tale of Khosrow and Shirin was a relatively brief episode. His main source is as recounted in the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi, whom Nezami in general treats with extreme respect. As we know, he also used the Shahnameh as a source for 2 more of his romances, that of the Haft Pekar, the 7 portraits, and the Eskandarnameh, which draw respectively on the tales of Bahram Gur and Eskandar, the Macedonian conqueror of Iran, Alexander, as they are presented in the Shahnameh. In each case, he does more or less the same things with material from the Shahnameh. He elaborates, he elevates, and he simultaneously, this seems paradoxical, but it's the case, he elaborates, he elevates, and he simultaneously both complicates and simplifies. The elaboration is part of the fact that he is devoting a whole poem to something that is only an episode in the Shahnameh. Many new narrative details are introduced, as well as new characters, and in each case the whole tale proceeds in a much more leisurely fashion. Because the story is told at much greater length, interest shifts, to some extent, from what actually happens to 2 other areas: what the characters feel, what we might call their psychology. The poems are much more inward in their concerns than are their models in the Shahnameh, and the way the story is told. Scenes are described in greater detail, and the rhetoric Nezami employs is generally more rich and complicated than that which Ferdowsi uses. That's an understatement. The poems are very self-consciously beautiful, endlessly so. This is perhaps especially true of Khosrow and Shirin, and ugliness is expunged. In very general terms, we can say that both the nature of the narrative and the way that it is rhetorically treated shift from what we expect of epic, as in the Shahnameh, to what we expect of romance. And this is analogous to similar developments in European literatures. The emphasis shifts from warfare to love. It shifts from action to psychology, or to inwardness at least. The elevation we find in Nezami's treatments of Ferdowsi's stories is part and parcel of his expunging of whatever is ugly. Ferdowsi's characters are complicated, and they often seem self-contradictory, especially in the Sasanian part of the poem, which is the part that Nezami draws on for all 3 of his romances. They can be quite nasty at times, like real people. In Nezami's hands, they become almost seamlessly noble. And though it's true that Khosrow has to work quite hard at being seamlessly noble, nevertheless he gets there. And in fact, his getting there, the getting of wisdom, is basically what the whole poem is about. Khosrow's marriage to Shirin in the Shahnameh is shadowed by some unspecified moral impurity of which Shirin has been accused. The royal court is given to discontented grumbling and mumbling about this, and Khosrow has to resort to some strong-arm tactics to shut them up. This is in the Shahnameh. But Shirin is never actually cleared of the charge. Khosrow simply says, "We won't talk about that anymore." And then Ferdowsi tells us that when she does become Khosrow's wife, Shirin is intensely jealous of Khosrow's first wife, Maryam, so she promptly poisons her. In the Shahnameh, Shirin is not a very attractive character. Khosrow himself, in Ferdowsi's account, is a rather desperate character who is thrown from crisis to crisis. He's put on the throne by his uncles, who murder his father. He's unable to defeat the rebel Bahram Chubin, except with the help of both Byzantium and heaven. He's manipulated by an evil vizier. He's suspicious of his son, whom he imprisons, and he's finally murdered at the instigation of this same son. It's all pretty sordid, in fact, in the Shahnameh. Nezami's version, by contrast, is, until the very end, virtually all sweetness and light, although there is still a very vague hint of something not quite right in Shirin's past. And Khosrow's advisors at first seem opposed to the marriage, until Khosrow makes a rather defensive speech about how suitable Shirin is to be his wife. In fact, he says it is his right to take her as wife, so shut up to the courtiers. In Nezami's telling of the tale, the accusation that Shirin poisoned Maryam is explicitly denied, although again the implication that Shirin is somehow guilty of Maryam's death is not quite cleared up. It's sort of implied that she does it by telepathy. She dislikes it so much that Maryam sort of shrivels up and dies. And for Nezami, it's Maryam who is the jealous schemer rather than Shirin. Shirin is not presented as jealous in Nezami, or not of Maryam anyway. The strongest contrast lies in the way that Ferdowsi's Khosrow seems almost entirely to lack agency. He appears to exist almost completely at the mercies of forces outside himself, whereas in Nezami's hands, Khosrow becomes a would-be gallant protagonist ennobled by the love of a pure woman. In fact, that's what the story is about. And his spiritual progress in proving himself worthy of her is presented as a kind of education sentimentale in which ethics and aesthetics become inextricably intertwined. It's in his treatment of the characters at the center of the tale that we see how Nezami both simplifies and complicates Ferdowsi's version. He simplifies them by omitting the negative qualities the characters possessed in the Shahnameh, or by using these qualities as the starting point for moral purification. He complicates them by implying a spiritual and symbolic dimension to the tale, which is not really there in the Shahnameh at all, so that the story has an aura of spiritual allegory to it. It is, perhaps much more, about the moral purification of an aspiring soul as it is a carnal love story. The implication of Sufism is never far away, although it's also true that it is rarely explicitly spelt out. It's more explicit in Layli Majnun than in Khosrow and Shirin. Khosrow and Shirin takes place, of course, in pre-Islamic Iran, and I want to look for a moment at Ferdowsi's apparent attitude towards this fact. Not towards the stories themselves, which Ferdowsi obviously loved and revered as passionately as anyone, but towards the fact that they take place in a pre-Islamic society. To put it bluntly, whenever Ferdowsi comes across something that Islam finds offensive, but which Iran's pre-Islamic social and moral structures accepted as perfectly normal, he misses it out, or he tries to elide it into something that can almost pass as Islamic, or he more or less explicitly disowns it. As an example of his, I'll give an example of each of those. As an example of his missing out something offensive to Islam, we can cite the absence in his text of the fact that Bahram Chubin was married to his sister Gaudier, a detail which was in at least one of Ferdowsi's sources, Dinawari's history. It's almost certain that Ferdowsi used Dinawari's history because many of the details he gives about Bahram Chubin are identical with the details given in Dinavari. In the Shahnameh, Gaudier cannot marry anyone while Bahram Chubin is alive, but it's never explained why. She just can't marry anybody. When Bahram Shirin dies, she suddenly has suitors, one of whom she kills and one of whom she accepts. In fact, Khosrow, the Khosrow of Khosrow and Shirin. But in Ferdowsi, it's the fact that Gaudiya and Bahram are married, brother and sister are married, is not mentioned, because this is obviously offensive to Islam, but it was perfectly normal in aristocratic pre-Islamic Iran, as it was in aristocratic Egypt in the ancient world too. As an example, most of the pharaohs, their parents were brother and sister, which accounts for a lot of the things that went wrong with the pharaohs. As an example of his trying to elide something decidedly non-Islamic into what might pass as a kind of Islam, we can cite his lines describing Ke Kavus and Ke Khosrow at prayer in the fire temple. Be yek hafte bar pish Yazdan budand, mapendar ke atash parastan budand, ke atash bedangah mehrab bud, parastande ra dide por ab bud. They presented themselves before God for a week. Do not think they were fire worshippers. The fire there at that time was a mehrab. The worshippers had their eyes full of tears. That is, he assimilates Zoroastrian ritual practice to Islamic ritual practice as far as this is possible. An obvious example of his washing his hands of a moment offensive to Islam is his reaction to the incestuous marriage of Bahman and his daughter Homayi. And it has to be in the Shahnameh because it produces the first Sasanian prince, or the ancestor of the Sasanian princes. Ferdowsi's comment on this union is, and he slept with her according to the custom called Pahlavi. That is, he disowns the union, insofar as it flouts the mores of his own time in faith. He says that that's what they did then. I'm not responsible for this story, this detail in the story. This moment is also, incidentally, an example of his omitting something offensive to Islam, as he describes the affair as a personal matter, rather than as an example of the intra-familial marriages that were common among the Sasanian aristocracy. And this makes it a localized scandal, which is much less serious than a customary occurrence, which would have condemned the whole of Sasanian society, in Islamic terms, as a state of sexually immoral ignorance. Ferdowsi skips over all that. We can say then that Ferdowsi deals with the mores of pre-Islamic Iran that could be considered offensive to Muslims, either by omitting them, by being shamefaced about them, or by assimilating them to Islamic practice as much as he could. If Nezami took the basic outline of his account of the tale of Khosrow and Shirin from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, it's also the case that a number of the most important incidents in the story are clearly modelled, often very closely, on similar incidents in Gorgani's Vis and Ramin. And Vis and Ramin is also the obvious source for Nezami's rhetorical treatment of erotic obsession and desire, although Nezami considerably complicates Gorgani's fairly straightforward treatment of such material, and he adds to it a moral dimension that Gorgani virtually ignores. Nezami is always moral. Whatever else he's doing, morality is always there. When it comes to the treatment of, and it's not there in Gorgani, when it comes to the treatment of pre-Islamic mores, and in particular of those that could be considered offensive by Muslims, Gorgani's approach is almost the complete opposite of Ferdowsi's. Where Ferdowsi omits such moments, Gorgani includes them. Where Ferdowsi elides them, Gorgani foregrounds them. And he shows none of Ferdowsi's embarrassment at having to describe un-Islamic incidents or subjects. His poem, Visoromin, virtually opens with a brother-sister marriage. The adulterers at the center of the poem go unpunished, and they proceed to live happily ever after. The king of Marv is virtually always drunk when he goes to bed, and there is no suggestion at all that this is a reprehensible state to be in. The implication is that that's what kings always are when they go to bed. Also, significantly, I think, there is none of the fuss about virginity, which tends to pervade medieval Islamic treatments of romantic love, and especially perhaps Nezami's treatments of it. Gorgani just doesn't give a damn about virginity. He cares about fidelity, but that's a different thing from virginity. You have to be faithful to the person you love, but that person needn't be your husband. Significantly enough, although Nezami explicitly thanks Ferdowsi for his legacy, he never mentions Gorgani. And when Vis herself is briefly mentioned by Shirin, Shirin condemns her as an immoral so-and-so. Later in the poem, Khosrow twice sleeps with someone whom he takes to be a prostitute. She isn't, in fact, but he thinks she is. And this woman is characterized as being another Vis. Vis and Ramin was clearly on Nezami's mind when he wrote Khosrow and Shirin. Vis is explicitly referred to twice, both times negatively, and in a number of the poems, incidents are clearly modelled on similar incidents in Vis and Ramin, even when this doesn't really make very logical, naturalistic sense. The most famous example is a snowstorm. There's a huge snowstorm in Vis and Ramin in which there is a paraklausitharon, which is a trope in which a lover is outside the beloved's door and begs to be admitted, and the beloved says no. This is a common trope in Greek and Latin poetry, and also in medieval poetry in the Islamic and in the Christian worlds. The snowstorm in Vis and Ramin takes place in Marv, in Central Asia, where there are, in fact, lots of snowstorms. The snowstorm in Khosrow and Shirin takes place at Shirin's castle, outside Shirin's castle. And a great fuss is made when Shirin's castle is being built, because it's built by people who hate her, that it's built in the most unsalubrious, hottest, driest, and most impossibly unbearable climate that can be found. That is, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a snowstorm there. But because Nezami wants to follow Gorgani's example in having the beloved outside the door the lover outside the door and the beloved refusing entrance, he makes this snowstorm which corresponds to as it appears in Gorgani's poem, although in Gorgani it's naturalistically possible, and in Khosrow and Shirin it really isn't possible, or it's not likely. It's equally clear that Nezami disapproved of Gorgani's poem, and especially of its heroine. He was attracted to something which an important part of his makeup strongly condemned. And this was a common problem in both the European Christian and Iranian Muslim Middle Ages when it came to dealing with material that predated an author's or reader's Muslim or Christian religious convictions. You can see the same problem with writers in the Christian era who deal with ancient Greek material. They've got all these gods. What do they do with them? They allegorize them. They decide that they're not real gods at all. No, they're allegories of human emotions and so forth. And when it came to dealing with material that predated an author's or reader's Muslim or Christian religious convictions, and in some ways seemed quite antithetical to them, the solution for many in both the Christian and Iranian Muslim worlds was to resort to allegory. As is famously the case, Nezami's love stories are always ambiguously teetering on the brink of allegory. Is this carnal love story an allegory of divine love? The ambiguity is deliberate, and a cynic could say that in this way the reader, as it were, can have his cake and eat it. He can read all these details about carnal love, but he can tell himself that this is a metaphor of spiritual aspiration. But there is another way, a more benign way of talking about this. I recently came across a remark about poetry. This might seem completely irrelevant, but it is relevant, I assure you. By the 17th century British philosopher Francis Bacon, which in many ways, I think, seems much more applicable to Persian poetry than to English poetry. Bacon is talking about poetry in general. In The Advancement of Learning, Bacon wrote, this is Bacon's words, "Poesy was ever thought to have some participation of divineness, because it doth raise and erect the mind by submitting the shows of things to the desires of the mind, whereas reason doth buckle and bow the mind unto the nature of things." That is, Bacon sees poetry as a way of elevating the mind towards the divine. And this seems to me to be a very good definition of what Nezami seems to see poetry as. This, in fact, is a very Neoplatonic view of art. And it's a view which persisted in the Middle East for much longer than it did in Europe. In the Renaissance, that view tends to disappear. It survives mainly in the literatures of southern Europe that border the Mediterranean, especially in Italian and to some extent in Spanish, although in Spanish there is an influence from Islam too. But it's completely lacking in the literatures of Northern Europe. In fact, that notion of art as a kind of Neoplatonic vehicle of spiritualization hardly exists in English poetry at all. There isn't time. I was going to read a very interesting, I think it's interesting, an interesting essay or part of it, by Sam Johnson, Dr. Johnson, who was the kind of arbiter of taste in 18th century in England. What he said was good poetry, and what he said was rubbish. Johnson says that religious poetry is a contradiction in terms. You can't have religious poetry. Basically what he says is religion is so much a greater thing than poetry. How dare poetry think that it can deal with religion? That's not the attitude in Persian poetry at all, but it is the attitude in most poetry written in English. English poetry of all periods, I think, it tends to be very practical and earthly in a way that Persian poetry often isn't. If a great deal of the Shahnameh can be morally assimilated to Islam without trouble, and this was, I believe, clearly Ferdowsi's aim, this is true of very little of Vis and Ramin. What Nezami does with pre-Islamic Iran, as he has received it from Ferdowsi and Gorgani, this is the main point I want to make today, is to make it safe for Islam. He sanitizes the Iranian pre-Islamic past in Islamic terms, and it is possible to read the whole of Khosrow and Shirin without ever feeling that Islam is being flouted or ignored or compromised. It's a pre-Islamic tale, but nothing in it, apart from the fact that we know it is, forces the reader to acknowledge this. I don't think it's too much to claim that Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin reads as though it were a tale taking place in a world in which Islamic values are both the writer's and the audience's values, and they are by implication the only possible values. This is very different from the worlds presented by both Ferdowsi and Gorgani. Ferdowsi is clearly aware of non-Islamic values, and he feels shamefaced about them. Gorgani appears to regard them neutrally, or even to delight in them. This is, I think, perhaps Nezami's most significant legacy to later Persian poetry. He makes pre-Islamic material, in Islamic terms, harmless. He draws its sting. In his hands it becomes familiarized, domesticated, uncontroversial, even a model to be emulated for the world of Iranian Islam. That's very far from both what Ferdowsi and Gorgani are doing. It's a historical fact, of course, that Khosrow Parviz, the historical king Khosrow Parviz that the poem is about, and the Prophet Muhammad were contemporaries for much of their lives. And there is a legend that Khosrow Parviz received a letter from the Prophet inviting him to embrace Islam. Nezami brings the Prophet into his poem towards its close, when Khosrow's vizier, Buzurg Omid, says that the new religion of the Arabs is the truth. He uses the word haq. In fact, Khosrow is questioning him about various things, and he's rather flippant about this new religion among the Arabs. And Buzurg Omid, who's been sort of going along with Khosrow's tone up to then, gets very serious and says, this is the truth, it's not to be joked about, be serious about this. And in fact, Nezami also adds as a kind of addendum to the whole poem, long after the poem, the story of it itself has finished, he gives in Persian his version of the letter and Khosrow's non-response to the letter. The poem therefore ends firmly in the world of Islam. It's significant, I think, that of the three love romances Nezami wrote, Khosrow and Shirin, Layli and Majnun, and the Haft Peykar, two of them, Khosrow and Shirin and Layli and Majnun, take place at more or less the moment of transition from the pre-Islamic world to the Islamic world. The story behind the tale of Layli and Majnun is said to have occurred in the 7th century, which is, of course, the century when this transition began to occur. Nezami makes sure that we understand we are in the Islamic world as the story of Layli and Majnun unfolds, because he has Majnun's father take Majnun on the Hajj to Mecca. Both poems are set around the moment of transition, and both end unequivocally in the world of Islam. I would like to leave Ferdowsi and Gorgani aside for now and turn to Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin, and you may think at about time too. Much of Nezami's verse has a very beguiling sheen to it. It seems to glitter and sparkle. It's extremely beautiful in a kind of brilliant way, brilliant in the sense of lots of light and glitter and jewels and glory and so on and so forth. But there is a moment quite near the poem where suddenly, for a very brief moment, a completely different atmosphere is established. It's an atmosphere which is dark and shadowy. It's not clear what's going on. It's not clear what we're supposed to see. It almost feels like a myth. It feels like Jungian myth, in fact. I don't know where Nezami got this incident, which I'll talk about now, where he got this incident from. And if anybody does, it's certainly not in Ferdowsi. If anybody does know, I'd be grateful for the information. This may seem a ridiculously irrelevant comparison, but it occurred to me, so I'll risk it. From letting our gaze drift across what seems like a sunlit canvas, a Canaletto painting of Venice, say, where everything is sparkling in the sun and is elegant and beautiful, we suddenly find that we are gazing at something like a disquieting scene by Rembrandt. It's a dark interior that hints at mystery and unspoken psychological, perhaps even mythical depths. We almost seem momentarily to be caught in an unsettling world of Jungian myth. What is this moment? I'm assuming that everyone here has a knowledge of at least the broad outline of the plot of Khosrow and Shirin, but just in case that's not so for all of us, I will briefly set the scene. Near the beginning of the poem, Khosrow's closest friend, Shapur, has heard about a princess in Arman, which is assumed to be Armenia, though I've recently seen a paper which disputes this, but everybody else has assumed it's Armenia. But wherever it is, a fabulously beautiful princess named Shirin lives there. Khosrow gets very excited at this bit of news, and he says to Shapur, I want you to go to Arman and find out about this princess, and find out especially if she's interested in getting married. And if she is, I want you to impress on her what a fine husband I would be. So off Shapur goes, and as he's leaving Iran and entering into unknown territory, and that in itself seems symbolically significant in a vague way, he's going out of his own world, as it were, he comes across a mountain. And high on the mountain, he sees that there is a monastery or convent. So he goes up to the convent and converses with one of the monks, who tells him something extraordinary. The monk says that underneath the convent, in the mountain, there is a dark cave on the mountainside, and in the cave there is a black rock. I will give this in my translation, just so that we can all follow it. One of these ancient monks addressed Shapur and told him of a wonder, an obscure dark cave that lies beneath the monastery, that's home to an egregious mystery. A black stone, like a horseman, seems to loom out of the eerie, inspissated gloom. At each conjunction of the stars, a mare who's come 100 parasangs is there, and now she is in season. Like a snake, she slips into the cavern's depths to slake her lust by rubbing her hindquarters on the surface of this black, mysterious stone. And by a miracle, by God's decree, this act ensures the mare's fertility, so that a foal born afterwards is twinned for speed with time itself and with the wind. The wise monk added, and it's this stone's seed that gives Shabdiz his fortitude and speed. Shabdiz is Shirin's horse and becomes Khosrow's horse, who's sort of semi-magical. The monks, I want us to think about this moment. There's the mountain with the convent at the top, and underneath that there is this cave with all this kind of dark, mysterious sexual stuff going on. The monks are, of course, celibate. Under their celibate home is a dark cave devoted to animal lust that involves some kind of chthonic magic. We are shown two wholly different, not to say completely opposed versions of what life is about. Up on the top of the mountain we have celibate monks who live in the light of heaven. That is, their life is an image of spirituality, chastity, and as far as we can see, the total excision of the animal aspects of human life. Under the convent, we have darkness, life in the apparently inescapable, because instinctive grip of animality and lust, and a complete absence of the spiritual, non-animal aspects of life. It would be very easy to do a Freudian analysis of this, but I will leave that out. But it's very obvious. Shapur stays for a night at the convent, and the next morning he continues on his journey. And Nezami immediately says, he tells the reader, that it's no good looking for the convent and the cave now, because they have been destroyed by a massive earthquake. The cave is never mentioned again, though the monastery possibly is, as Khosrow later stays at a monastery on his way to Arman. But we aren't told whether or not it's the same monastery that Shapur has stayed in. What is this incident doing in the poem? Why is it there? I said earlier on that the poem's plot is a kind of education sentimentale in which the hero, Khosrow, becomes in Nezami's hands a would-be gallant protagonist, ennobled by the love of a pure woman, and that the poem is largely about his spiritual progress in proving himself worthy of her. And it takes him a long time, and even at the very end he stumbles. On their wedding night he gets so drunk that he passes out, and Shirin thinks, oh, for goodness sake, take him away. In other words, it is about the progress from the instinctive, rather animalistic life of Khosrow's youth towards the spiritual and ordered life that makes him worthy of love, of Shirin's love. It is the progress from the cave towards something like the convent. And this progress is done for and largely at the insistent instigation of Shirin. Shirin has traditionally and always been regarded as a Christian princess, though Nezami doesn't actually say this. It's implied, but he doesn't say it. And the editor and commentator of the edition I'm using for my translation, Behruz Sarvatian, it's a brilliant edition. He remarks on some of Shirin's speeches, and he finds that they echo some moments of Christian doctrine. I'm not entirely sure about this, but as Sarvatiyan says it, and I have the greatest respect for his scholarship, I offer it. So there is the monks are Christians. Khosrow is trying to make himself worthy of a Christian princess. And so this transition from the animal to the spiritual is echoed in his life. And the monks in the convent towards which I am suggesting Khosrow, as it were, symbolically ascends are, of course, Christian. As if obliquely to confirm that there is no point in trying to get to this convent now, Nezami says, and I just mentioned this, that it has been destroyed by an earthquake and no longer exists, a statement I will come back to later. Before Khosrow became aware of Shirin's existence, he is presented as a quite unworthy prince, not so much evil as selfish, careless, and in moral terms hopelessly inept. A prince who would, it seems, turn out to be an ineffective king, one who, while not being evil himself, would allow evil to flourish unchecked around him, which is what he does when he's a young man. He's not a particularly nasty person, but some of his companions are. The first time we see him as a young adult, he goes on an expedition which is clearly meant as a brief resume of his shortcomings. He goes hunting, and in a peremptory fashion, he requisitions a peasant's hut for the night. The peasant doesn't have much choice in the matter. He just says, we'll have your hut for the night, where he and his entourage drink and carouse until dawn, keeping the whole village awake and scandalizing its womenfolk, while his horse tramples the new crops and his personal page steals grapes from an orchard. Khosrow is severely reprimanded by his father, King Hormuz, for this expedition, and he acknowledges his faults and promises to amend his behavior. It's only when he hears about Shirin that we see his conduct really begin to change, though. He has something to aspire to, something that's beyond his grasp that he must strive for. His burgeoning love for Shirin makes him realize that there is something else in the world that is at least as important as himself and his own pleasure, which is all he's cared about up to then, even though at the beginning of their love he sees her chiefly as something that can contribute to his pleasure. From here on, aspiration becomes the keynote of the poem. And as I have said, aspiration, here specifically Khosrow's aspiration to become worthy of Shirin, is in a sense what the whole poem is about. Now here I have to take a brief detour, and I hope it is brief, into a generalization about what I take to be Nezami's major artistic concern. This is going back to the point I made before about making the pre-Islamic world safe for Islam, and I hope you will bear with me. I have remarked elsewhere on the extraordinary lushness and complexity of Nezami's rhetorical strategies, something of which I think every reader of his poetry must soon become aware. His tropes are very complicated indeed often, and they take pages of commentary to explain them. And very often Sarvatiyan, who gives pages of commentary on particular tropes, will say at the end, it's not clear what this means. Nezami is in the most strictly literal sense a highly artificial poet. In fact, we can say his poetry is a poetry that delights in and advertises its artificiality. For a modern reader, this can be a problem. The modern reader tends to assume almost automatically that artifice precludes authenticity of being and feeling. Here we have artifice, and here we have authenticity, and never the twain shall meet. That tends to be the modern view of art. This doesn't hold for medieval verse at all, in which artifice embodies and is the most visible way of presenting feeling. Artifice both concentrates and diffuses the presence in a poem of the artistic sensibility that has created it. Passion and artifice, authentic emotion, and elaborately self-conscious rhetoric are partners, not adversaries, in medieval verse. And you can't understand medieval verse, this is as true of Christian medieval verse as it is of Islamic medieval verse, unless you understand this point. And this is nowhere more true than in Nezami's poetry. I would suggest that Nezami chose this particular pen name, his takhalos, because it draws attention to the artificiality of art and especially of poetry. He calls himself Nezami. Art is nature ordered, arranged, reconstructed, so that it becomes something beautiful and above all civilized. Art for Nezami is something that aspires to and embodies civilization. It embodies the desire to pass beyond unredeemed, ordinary, quotidian, secular life. It calls the reader or auditor to aspire to and participate in something quasi-supernatural, something which partakes of the sacred, what Bacon calls, in the quotation that I read earlier, some participation in divineness. Art for Nezami is a major constituent of the civilized life, which is an analogy and accompaniment to the spiritual life. And in return, civilization is what makes art possible, and each validates and supports the other. It is therefore extremely significant, I think, that the love affair which provides the plot of the poem and is the means by which the at first unregenerate Khosrow is over the course of the poem made worthy of Shirin's love, this love affair both begins and ends by means of art. Shirin falls in love with Khosrow because she sees Shahpur's paintings of him. It is art that makes her fall in love. The difficulties of their love affair at the end are resolved by each of the lovers discovering the other's true feelings when they hear the musicians Barbad and Nakiso sing songs, poems that are set to music, that describe these feelings. Again, there's poetry and music, and there's painting. These are the ways that the love is begun and resolved, as it were, in the poem. It's art that does it. Art is crucial for Nezami. It's not an add-on to civilization, it is civilization. It was common for medieval poets to exist and be interpreted. Actually, I'm going on too long, and I'm going to skip a bit. I was going to compare him to Dante, but I don't think we need to compare him to Dante. They're very similar, in fact, in many ways. But we'll leave that. The most basic and obvious level of the story, I suggest in my comparison with Dante that there are three levels to Khosrow and Shirin. The most basic and obvious level is the story of Khosrow's love for Shirin and the way that this ennobles Khosrow and makes him worthy to be both the king and Shirin's husband. And it's significant that Shirin refuses to allow him to be her lover until he becomes a king in actuality rather than simply in name. The poem is also more generally and allegorically the story of a man educated by art and by love so that he can both partake in and be himself an emblem of the civilized life that is informed by love and manifested by art. And finally, it is, I would suggest, the story of Iran itself, as it leaves behind its, in Islamic terms, unregenerate pre-Islamic state and enters the world of civilization, which for Nezami must necessarily mean the world of Islam. Khosrow's Iran, in Nezami's eyes, is through Khosrow himself, as it were, purified by love and art, so that it is in a state which makes it receptive to the new manifestation of civilization in Islamic terms that was emerging in the historical Khosrow Parviz's lifetime, and which Nezami emphasizes in the poem's closing pages. And to go back to that earthquake that Nezami says destroyed the Christian monastery and the animalistic cave behind it. This earthquake is, beneath it, not behind it. This earthquake is, I would suggest, the coming of Islam, which renders the Christian and pre-Islamic worlds generally obsolete. There is no necessity for them to exist in the world any longer, and the earthquake underlines this. I'm not sure if that's conscious on Nezami's part, but as soon as you become aware of the general movement of the poem, it's certainly there, especially the fact that he really emphasizes there's no point in looking for this now. We don't need it. It's gone. An earthquake has destroyed it all. As Nezami says, nowadays there is no longer any point in seeking the monastery and the cave. They have been superseded. I would like to end on a completely different note. At the very end of the poem, after the lovers are dead, Nezami remarks on how foolish the notion of women as weaker than men is. That's one of the nice things about Nezami. He does stick up for women a lot, which most Iranian poets of the Middle Ages don't, unfortunately. Some do, many don't. And Nezami does more than most. Nezami talks about how valiant and strong Shirin has been throughout their story, and how, by contrast, dilatory and lackadaisical in coming up to the moral mark, Khosrow has been. Given what's going on in Iran at the moment, Nezami's comment seems particularly relevant for now. All women are not weak. Weak is a man who runs from pain and effort when he can. How many lovely women show their hearts can be like angry lions when trouble starts? That seems a good place to end my talk, but I would like to add one more comment. I retired as an academic 11 years ago. This is a personal comment, and I won't make too much fuss about it, but I want to say it. And though I have continued to work on Persian-related subjects and to translate medieval Persian poetry since then, I feel that Khosrow and Shirin will very probably be the last long medieval poem that I shall attempt to translate into English. I'm 78 and feeling it. People have in general been very nice to me over the years about my translations and other Persian-related writings. I say in general because one can't please everyone, and I have had some brickbats too. some pretty nasty ones in fact, but by and large the reaction has been generous and positive. As perhaps some of you know, the first translation I did from Persian was of Attar's Conference of the Birds, the Mantagoter, and this was done in conjunction with my wife Afgham Darbandi, who is here, but I won't point her out because she'll be embarrassed. This was before I completed my doctorate in medieval Persian, and I certainly couldn't have done this translation without her. After this, Afgham more or less said, "From now on, you're on your own, Dick." And my subsequent translations were done under my own name rather than under Afgham's and mine. Nevertheless, Afgham has always been an extremely encouraging, supportive, and helpful presence whilst I have been involved with Persian-related subjects. Not only helpful in the specific and literal sense of explaining to me idioms, usages, and proverbs and so forth of which I wasn't aware, but in the more general and overarching sense that her presence has always been unfailingly encouraging and enabling, and I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to her. Leaving aside the brickbats, much of the praise that my translations have received is due to Afgham's continuous support and help, and I would like to take this public opportunity to acknowledge this and to thank her profoundly for her always crucial and inspiring presence in my life and in my work. Thank you.